It was a perfect June afternoon in St. Mary Mead, a day when the sun hung like a golden coin in the sky, and the scent of freshly mowed lawns mixed pleasantly with the aroma of lemon cakes and cucumber sandwiches. The annual garden party, hosted by Mrs. Dorothy Whittaker, was the event of the season, attracting nearly every respectable resident of the village to the sprawling lawns of the Whittaker estate. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the tea tent, observed the gathering with her usual quiet interest. Her knitting needles clicked softly as her sharp blue eyes flicked from one guest to another, cataloguing each expression, each laugh, each small betrayal of true emotion. "Mrs. Whittaker has certainly outdone herself this year," said Reverend Leonard Clement, who had joined Miss Marple for a cup of tea. "The rhododendrons are particularly stunning." "Indeed," replied Miss Marple, her tone mild, "though I do think Mrs. Whittaker's gardener, young Geoffrey, deserves most of the credit. He's rather skilled for his age." Before the Reverend could respond, a shrill scream shattered the idyllic scene. All heads turned toward the pavilion, where Mrs. Whittaker stood trembling, a hand pressed to her chest. "It's Cook!" she cried. "Cook is dead!" Gasps rippled through the crowd. The cook, Mrs. Emily Gosforth, was well known in the village for her culinary prowess and sharp tongue. A woman not easily rattled, let alone felled. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to her feet with a quiet determination. She moved toward the pavilion, blending into the concerned throng like a shadow. Inside, she found Dr. Haydock kneeling beside the lifeless form of Mrs. Gosforth. The cook lay sprawled on the floor, her face pale, and an overturned tray of eclairs scattered nearby. "Dead," Dr. Haydock confirmed grimly. "Poison, I'd wager. We'll need to send her to the coroner to be certain." Whispers surged through the crowd like an incoming tide. Poison? In St. Mary Mead. Such things were the stuff of penny dreadfuls, not their tranquil village. Miss Marple leaned slightly toward Dr. Haydock, her voice soft and unassuming. "A dreadful business, Doctor. Was she ill recently? Or troubled?" Haydock shook his head. "Not that I'm aware of. She was as robust as they come." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her gaze drifting to the tray of eclairs. She noticed the uneven arrangement of the pastries and a single, crushed piece beneath the corner of the table. "Such a pity," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Around her, the village buzzed with speculation. Who could have wanted to harm Mrs. Gosforth? Was it an accident or something far darker? As the constable arrived to disperse the crowd, Miss Marple quietly slipped back to her seat. She resumed her knitting, her expression serene. But behind her calm exterior, her mind was already at work, sorting through the threads of human nature that had just begun to unravel. The stage was set, and the mystery of the poisoned cook was about to unfold. The news of Mrs. Gosforth's sudden demise spread through St. Mary Mead faster than wildfire on a dry heath. By the time the sun began to set that evening, every household was alive with speculation. Windows glowed with lamplight as tea kettles hissed and tongues wagged, eager to dissect every morsel of information. At the Bluebell Tea Room, a favorite gathering spot for the village ladies, the subject was on everyone's lips. "Well, if you ask me, it's that new girl from the post office," declared Mrs. Diana Trent, her spectacles glinting in the lamplight. "I saw her arguing with Mrs. Gosforth last week about an overdue parcel. Very suspicious, don't you think?" "I heard it was young Geoffrey, the gardener," said Mrs. Perkins, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say Mrs. Gosforth caught him taking bottles from the pantry. Maybe she threatened to tell Mrs. Whittaker." Across the room, Miss Marple sat quietly with her tea, listening without comment. Her hands, resting in her lap, were as still as her expression. To the casual observer, she seemed absorbed in her scone, but in truth, she was filing away every word, every glance, and every inconsistency. The Whittaker household was in disarray. Mrs. Dorothy Whittaker, a stout woman with a tendency toward dramatics, had taken to her chaise longue, fanning herself vigorously. Her husband, Henry Whittaker, a wiry man with perpetually furrowed brows, paced the room, muttering about the scandal. "Poison! In our home! What will people think?" Henry snapped, glaring at the untouched brandy in his hand. "Think? They'll think we're cursed, Henry," Dorothy moaned. "First the bad harvest, then the fire in the barn, and now this. Poor Emily, she's been with us for over a decade." "She was more than just a cook," Henry admitted grudgingly. "She kept this household running." "And now—" He trailed off, his face dark with thought. At that moment, the door creaked open, and Geoffrey, the gardener, stepped in hesitantly. His usually tanned face was pale, and his hands trembled as he twisted his cap. I wanted to say how sorry I am," he mumbled. "Mrs. Gosforth was good to me. Gave me her leftover soup every Thursday." Dorothy sniffed, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Thank you, Geoffrey." It's comforting to know she had friends. Henry, however, fixed Geoffrey with a sharp look. "You were in the kitchen yesterday, weren't you? Did you see anything unusual?" Geoffrey hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. "Nothing, sir. Just cook grumbling about her new recipes. Said they weren't worth the paper they were written on." Miss Marple, who had been sitting unobtrusively in the corner with her knitting, looked up at this. "New recipes, you say? That's curious. Was she in the habit of trying new things?" "No, miss," Geoffrey replied, frowning. "Said she didn't trust them. Thought they were all wrong somehow." Meanwhile, the Reverend Leonard Clement found himself besieged by the village's moral dilemmas. "Reverend, this is a sign," declared Mrs. Hartnell, the village's self-appointed moral compass. "Poison in our midst. It's divine retribution for modern laxity. Too much frivolity, not enough prayer." Clement sighed inwardly but nodded politely. A tragic event indeed. But we must remember that judgment belongs to God, not man. "Oh, I don't judge, Reverend," Mrs. Hartnell assured him with an air of self-righteousness. "I merely observe. And mark my words, it's those Whittakers. That family has always been peculiar." Miss Marple, who had arrived to return a borrowed book, heard this remark as she stepped into the vicarage. "Peculiar, Mrs. Hartnell? How so?" The woman turned, startled, then sniffed dismissively. "Oh, you know, all that talk of investments and foreign travel, it's not natural." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, a faint smile playing on her lips, "though I find most people peculiar in their own way." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and poured herself a cup of tea. The death of Mrs. Gosforth had rattled the village, and in the chaos of rumor and suspicion, certain details stood out to her. 1. The recipe books. Why had Mrs. Gosforth been grumbling about recipes? Was it simply her usual temperament, or had she been unsettled by something specific? 2. Geoffrey's nervousness. The young gardener had seemed genuinely upset, but his hesitation spoke of more than grief. Was he hiding something? 3. The eclairs. Food had been the vehicle of death, but why eclairs? They weren't Mrs. Gosforth's usual fare. Someone had chosen them deliberately. 4. Mrs. Hartnell's comment. The Whittakers were peculiar, yes, but hardly criminal. Still, the idea of financial troubles had planted a seed in her mind. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a fleeting expression of both amusement and resolve. People often underestimated the complexities of village life. Beneath the tranquil surface, there were rivalries, resentments, and secrets aplenty. The key was to unravel them one thread at a time. For now, she would wait. People revealed far more than they realized, given time, and Miss Marple, with her unparalleled patience and unerring instincts, was always listening. The web of intrigue around Mrs. Gosforth's death was growing, and Miss Marple, though silent, was already beginning to pull at the first threads. The following morning, the village was still abuzz with theories and gossip. The constable, Mr. Arthur Craddock, had taken official charge of the case, though his investigative methods left much to be desired. Craddock, a stocky man with an air of self-importance, prided himself on his efficiency, though efficiency, in this instance, seemed to mean jumping to conclusions. "It's obvious, isn't it?" Craddock declared to his assistant, young Constable Jennings. "Mrs. Gosforth wasn't well liked. Plenty of people might have had a reason to do her in." "Do we have any concrete suspects, sir?" Jennings asked, his pencil poised over a notepad. "Start with Geoffrey, the gardener," Craddock instructed. "He's young, he's poor, and he's nervous." "That's motive enough," Miss Marple, who had stopped by the station ostensibly to deliver a basket of scones for the constables, caught this exchange and raised an eyebrow. She said nothing, however, merely placing the basket on the desk with a gentle, "Good morning, gentlemen," before departing. Back in the village, Miss Marple made a point of visiting those who had been closest to Mrs. Gosforth. Her manner was as unassuming as ever, her questions framed as innocent curiosity. Her first stop was the Whittaker estate, where she found Dorothy Whittaker in the morning room, sipping tea with an air of melancholy. "Such a tragedy," Dorothy said, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. "Poor Emily was more like family than staff. I can't imagine why anyone would want to harm her." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. "I understand she had a bit of a temper, but surely that's not uncommon in a cook of her experience." Dorothy hesitated. "Well, yes, she could be a bit sharp-tongued. She had her disagreements with people, of course, most recently with my husband, Henry," Miss Marple asked, her tone light. Dorothy sighed. Emily had taken to criticizing his spending habits. She thought he was too extravagant, buying imported wines, hosting lavish dinners. I suppose she thought she was protecting us, in her own way. But Henry didn't take kindly to it. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet she continued to cook for these events." "Oh, yes. She was ever the professional," Dorothy replied, "though I do remember her muttering about not being taken for granted." Miss Marple's next stop was the village market, where Geoffrey the gardener was unloading crates of vegetables. She approached him with a kind smile. "Good morning, Geoffrey. How are you holding up?" Geoffrey looked up, startled. "Miss Marple." I'm all right, I suppose. It's just such a shock, you know. Mrs. Gosforth was, well, she was always there. It's hard to believe she's gone." "She spoke highly of you," Miss Marple said gently. "Said you were a hard worker." Geoffrey flushed. "She did." "That's kind of her. She could be strict, but she was fair." "Still, I imagine working under her wasn't always easy," Miss Marple continued, her tone casual. "Did you ever have disagreements?" Geoffrey hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing serious, miss. Just little things. Like when she caught me borrowing a bottle of sherry last Christmas. She gave me a proper telling off, but that was the end of it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And yesterday? Did you notice anything unusual in the kitchen?" Geoffrey frowned, scratching his head. "Now that you mention it, there was a strange smell. Like almonds. I thought it was some fancy ingredient she was using, but now—" His voice trailed off, and he looked pale. "Almonds, you say?" Miss Marple repeated. "How interesting." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Beach, the owner of the village bookshop. Mrs. Beach was known for her keen memory and her tendency to notice what others overlooked. "Ah, Miss Marple," Mrs. Beach said as her visitor entered. "I was just thinking of you. Have you heard about this dreadful business with poor Mrs. Gosforth?" Such a tragedy, Miss Marple agreed, browsing the shelves. I understand she'd recently acquired a new recipe book. Do you happen to know where it came from? Mrs. Beach pursed her lips, thinking. Now that you mention it, she bought a book from me last month. Exquisite European Pastries, it was called. She said Mrs. Whittaker had requested something special for the garden party. European pastries, you say? Miss Marple echoed. How curious. Did she seem pleased with the book? Well, not entirely, Mrs. Beach admitted. She returned the book a week later, saying the recipes were too complicated and didn't make sense. She was quite cross about it. How very peculiar, Miss Marple murmured, filing the information away. Later that day, Miss Marple visited Dr. Haydock under the pretense of delivering some knitted blankets for his patients. You're a marvel, Miss Marple, Haydock said with a smile, accepting the neatly folded bundle. And how are you faring with all this excitement? Well enough, Doctor, Miss Marple replied. I was just wondering if the coroner's report had turned up anything unusual. Haydock's expression turned grave. Indeed it has. Mrs. Gosforth's death was caused by cyanide poisoning. A potent dose, likely ingested. Cyanide, Miss Marple repeated softly. The smell of almonds, I presume? Precisely, Haydock confirmed, and given the timing, it's likely the poison was in something she ate shortly before her death. Such as an eclair? Haydock nodded. The eclairs were sent for testing. If I were a betting man, I'd say that's where we'll find the cyanide. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, knitting in her lap and a cup of tea at her side. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape. 1. The smell of almonds. Geoffrey's observation confirmed. The presence of cyanide, narrowing the focus to the eclairs. 2. The recipe book. Mrs. Gosforth's dissatisfaction with the European pastry book hinted at a deeper grievance. 3. Financial tensions. Dorothy Whittaker's comment about her husband's spending suggested potential motives within the Whittaker household. 4. Borrowed sherry. Geoffrey's admission was interesting but didn't yet feel like the key to the mystery. Miss Marple's fingers paused mid-stitch as a thought struck her. The book. Could it have been tampered with? And if so, by whom? For now she would wait and watch. The truth, she knew, was often hidden in plain sight. All one needed was the patience to see it. The investigation deepens, and Miss Marple's subtle deductions bring her ever closer to the truth. The following day dawned with a heavy mist hanging over St. Mary Mead, casting an almost ethereal air over the small village. As the constables continued their investigations, the villagers eagerly shared their theories, each one more outlandish than the last. The case of Mrs. Gosforth's death had become the central focus of everyone's lives, a rare and macabre disruption to their otherwise predictable routines. Constable Craddock's first target was Geoffrey the gardener. By mid-morning, he had summoned Geoffrey to the station for questioning. The young man sat nervously in the chair opposite Craddock, twisting his cap in his hands. You were seen in the kitchen the day of Mrs. Gosforth's death, Craddock began, his voice stern. What were you doing there? I was just delivering the herbs she asked for, Geoffrey replied quickly. Parsley and thyme. She said she needed them for the eclairs. Herbs for eclairs. Craddock frowned. Sounds strange, don't you think? Geoffrey shrugged helplessly. I thought so too, but Mrs. Gosforth had her ways. I didn't ask questions. And did you notice anything unusual while you were there? Craddock pressed. Well, I told Miss Marple about the almond smell, Geoffrey said, his voice trembling. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now... Craddock leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. You had access to the kitchen, you knew where the sherry was kept, and you were nervous around Mrs. Gosforth. Sounds like a motive to me. Geoffrey's face turned pale. "I swear I didn't do anything. I liked Mrs. Gosforth. She was strict, but she was fair. Why would I harm her?" Craddock wasn't convinced. "You've got means, opportunity, and a shaky alibi. That makes you my prime suspect, son." While Craddock was focused on Geoffrey, Miss Marple decided to investigate another lead. She called on Mrs. Edith Plummer, a retired governess who had been a close friend of Mrs. Gosforth's. Mrs. Plummer lived in a cozy cottage on the edge of the village, surrounded by a riotous garden of flowers and herbs. She welcomed Miss Marple with a pot of strong tea and a plate of shortbread. "Such a dreadful business," Mrs. Plummer said, shaking her head. "I can't imagine who would want to harm poor Emily." "She was a strong-willed woman," Miss Marple replied gently, stirring her tea. "Perhaps she made enemies without realizing it." Mrs. Plummer sighed. She did have a way of speaking her mind, but she was loyal to a fault. "If you ask me, this has something to do with that new pastry book she was working from. She said it was all wrong, measurements that didn't add up, instructions that made no sense. It frustrated her to no end." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with interest. "Did she ever mention who gave her the book?" "Yes, it was Mrs. Whittaker's idea," Mrs. Plummer said, her tone tinged with disapproval. "She insisted on something continental for the garden party. Emily wasn't keen on it, but she felt she had no choice." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple murmured. "I wonder if anyone else knew of her frustrations." "Well, she did complain to Mr. Whittaker," Mrs. Plummer said. "He told her to stop being so dramatic." That didn't sit well with Emily, I can tell you. That afternoon, Miss Marple found herself back at the Whittaker estate, where she encountered Henry Whittaker in his study. The man seemed distracted, shuffling papers on his desk with an air of irritation. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, barely looking up. "What brings you here?" "I was hoping to ask a few questions about Mrs. Gosforth," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Henry sighed heavily. "I've already told the constable everything I know. Emily was a fine cook, but she had a temper. If you're looking for enemies, I'd say start with her." "Enemies, you say?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did she have many?" "Plenty," Henry replied bluntly. "She had no patience for fools, and she wasn't shy about saying so. Why, just last month she nearly came to blows with the butcher over the quality of his lamb chops." "Did her temper ever extend to the household staff?" Miss Marple asked. Henry hesitated. "She did have her disagreements with Geoffrey, but they were minor. Nothing serious. And what about you, Mr. Whittaker? I understand you and Mrs. Gosforth had a rather spirited discussion about household expenses recently." Henry's face darkened. "That's none of your business, Miss Marple. Emily and I may have had our differences, but I'd never harm her." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course not. Thank you for your time." As the sun began to set, Miss Marple made one final stop at the constabulary to speak with Constable Jennings, who had just returned from inspecting Mrs. Gosforth's belongings. "Good evening, Miss Marple," Jennings greeted her, tipping his hat. "What brings you here?" "I was wondering if anything unusual turned up in Mrs. Gosforth's effects," she said. "Well, there was one thing," Jennings admitted, pulling a small leather-bound notebook from his pocket. "Her recipe book. It's got her usual notes and comments, but there's something odd. There's a page missing." "A page missing?" Miss Marple repeated, her brows knitting together. "Yes," Jennings said. "It looks like it was torn out recently. And from the indentation on the opposite page, it might have been the recipe for eclairs." "How very peculiar," Miss Marple murmured. "May I see it?" Jennings handed her the notebook, and she examined it carefully. The torn page was jagged, as though it had been removed in haste. She also noticed faint smudges of ink in the margins, as though someone had tried to erase a note. "Thank you, Constable," she said, returning the notebook. "This has been most enlightening." That evening, as she sat in her cozy parlor, Miss Marple reviewed the day's findings. 1. Geoffrey's alibi. The gardener remained the most obvious suspect, but his nervousness seemed more like fear than guilt. 2. The Whitakers' involvement. Both Dorothy and Henry had motives, though neither seemed likely to act on them. 3. The missing page. The torn recipe suggested a deliberate act. Was it possible the poison had been introduced during the preparation of the eclairs? 4. The pastry book. Mrs. Gosforth's frustrations with the book hinted at deeper tensions. Could it have been part of the plot? Miss Marple's fingers paused in their knitting as she considered the puzzle before her. The missing page and the tampered recipe were critical clues. But to uncover the truth, she would need to probe further into the secrets of St. Mary Mead. With a faint smile, she set her knitting aside and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, and Miss Marple was ready. The investigation deepens, with multiple suspects and tantalizing clues pointing in different directions. The mystery of the missing recipe page adds a new layer of intrigue, bringing Miss Marple closer to the heart of the matter. The atmosphere in St. Mary Mead grew tenser with each passing day. While Constable Craddock continued to focus his efforts on Geoffrey, Miss Marple quietly pursued her inquiries, gathering insights that others dismissed as irrelevant. She knew well that it was often the smallest, most seemingly insignificant details that revealed the truth. The village's annual church bazaar proceeded as planned, though the cheerful bunting and lively chatter were dampened by the shadow of Mrs. Gosforth's murder. Miss Marple arrived early, setting up her knitting stall with a practiced efficiency. Amid the stalls selling jams, second-hand books, and hand-stitched linens, the villagers whispered. Conversations all circled back to the same topic: the mysterious death. "She must have eaten the eclairs," Mrs. Hartnell declared confidently to a small gathering near the baked goods stall. "I've always said those fancy pastries are nothing but trouble." "Oh, nonsense," replied Colonel Bantry, who was inspecting a rack of gardening tools. "This is no accident, it's murder." "Mark my words, someone wanted Mrs. Gosforth gone." Miss Marple's ears perked up at the exchange, though she didn't interject. Instead, she busied herself arranging her skeins of yarn and waited for her opportunity to gather more information. Miss Marple's patience was rewarded when Mrs. Whittaker arrived at the bazaar, accompanied by her housekeeper, Agnes. The two women browsed the stalls, chatting in low voices. "Honestly, Dorothy, you've been on edge all week," Agnes said as they stopped to admire a selection of china teacups. "Can you blame me?" Dorothy replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "First Emily's death and now Henry's odd behavior. He's been locking himself in the study for hours on end." "I don't know what he's hiding," Agnes tutted sympathetically. "Men can be so secretive. But I'm sure it's nothing to worry about." Miss Marple, pretending to examine a display of lace doilies nearby, made a mental note of Dorothy's remark. As the bazaar wound down, Miss Marple made her way to the Whittaker estate. She was greeted at the door by Agnes, who seemed surprised but not displeased to see her. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Agnes said. "What brings you here?" "I was hoping to have a word with Mrs. Whittaker," Miss Marple replied, her smile as warm as ever. Agnes hesitated. "She's resting, I'm afraid." "It's been a trying week, but if there's something I can help you with..." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Actually, there is. I understand that Mrs. Gosforth was using a new recipe book before her death. Do you happen to know where it might be?" Agnes frowned. "I think it's still in the kitchen. Mrs. Gosforth was always very particular about her things, so we didn't touch anything after. Well, you understand? Of course, Miss Marple said. Might I have a look? Agnes nodded reluctantly and led her to the kitchen. The kitchen was eerily quiet, its gleaming surfaces a testament to Mrs. Gosforth's meticulous nature. The recipe book lay on the counter, its cover slightly worn. Miss Marple opened it carefully, flipping through the pages until she reached the section on pastries. She paused at a recipe for eclairs. The instructions were detailed, but something struck her as odd. A faint indentation on the page suggested that a handwritten note had once been there, but had been erased. Curious, Miss Marple murmured. She ran her fingers lightly over the page, noting the uneven texture. What is it? Agnes asked, peering over her shoulder. Just a little mystery, Miss Marple replied. Tell me, Agnes, did anyone else handle this book recently? Agnes thought for a moment. Well, Mrs. Whittaker gave it to Mrs. Gosforth, but I don't think anyone else used it. At least, not that I know of. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Agnes. You've been very helpful. On her way home, Miss Marple stopped by Dr. Haydock's office to share her findings. Faint indentations on the recipe page, you say? Haydock repeated, examining the book. Yes, Miss Marple confirmed. I believe there was a note written there, which was later erased. It could be a critical clue. Haydock fetched a small magnifying glass and scrutinized the page. There's definitely something here. If you'd like, I can try applying a bit of graphite powder to make the writing visible. Would you? Miss Marple asked, her eyes twinkling with anticipation. After a few moments of delicate work, Haydock revealed a faint but legible note. Use sparingly. Too much will spoil the flavor. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. How very intriguing. This suggests that someone altered the recipe intentionally. But who? And why? That evening, Miss Marple decided to take a walk through the village, her thoughts swirling with possibilities. As she passed the Whittaker estate, she noticed a light on in the study. She paused, her sharp eyes narrowing as she observed a figure moving inside. It was Henry Whittaker, pacing back and forth, his face taut with worry. Miss Marple lingered for a moment longer before continuing on her way. The missing recipe page, the erased note, and Henry's strange behavior were pieces of a puzzle that was slowly coming together. Back in her cozy parlor, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting in hand. She reviewed the day's discoveries. 1. The altered recipe. The erased note pointed to deliberate tampering. Someone had added instructions to the recipe, then removed them after the fact. 2. Henry Whittaker's behavior. His late-night pacing suggested guilt or anxiety. Was he hiding something related to Mrs. Gosforth's death? 3. Dorothy's remark. Her suspicion of Henry added weight to the idea that the Whittakers were more involved than they let on. 4. The smell of almonds. The cyanide's distinctive scent was still the most damning clue, tying the poison to the eclairs. Miss Marple's fingers paused in their work as a sudden thought occurred to her. If the recipe had been altered, perhaps it wasn't meant for Mrs. Gosforth at all. Could the intended target have been someone else? Her mind raced with possibilities, but she knew better than to jump to conclusions. The truth, she reminded herself, was often hidden beneath layers of human complexity. All she needed was patience, and perhaps one more clue. Miss Marple's quiet investigation reveals a hidden clue that could change the entire course of the case. The altered recipe and the erased note add new layers of intrigue, bringing her one step closer to uncovering the truth. St. Mary Mead, often a picture of tranquility, had become a hive of speculation and intrigue. Miss Marple, as was her way, moved unobtrusively through the village, piecing together fragments of conversations, stray observations, and her deep knowledge of human nature. She knew the answers to Mrs. Gosforth's death lay not in the eclairs themselves, but in the tangled web of relationships and secrets within the community. The next morning, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to Mr. Rudge, the village butcher. Known for his gruff demeanor and sharp tongue, Mr. Rudge had been the subject of Mrs. Gosforth's complaints about the lamb chops. As Miss Marple stepped into the shop, Mr. Rudge was slicing a roast, his hands moving with practiced precision. "Morning, Miss Marple," he greeted her. "What can I do for you?" "A bit of lamb, perhaps." "Good morning, Mr. Rudge," Miss Marple replied with a smile. "I was actually hoping to ask you about Mrs. Gosforth." Mr. Rudge scowled. That woman was never satisfied. Always found something to nitpick about, but I wouldn't wish what happened to her on anyone. "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed, "though I understand she was particularly upset with you last month." Mr. Rudge snorted. "She said my lamb chops were too fatty. Told me I was running a substandard operation." He paused, wiping his hands on his apron. "But Emily wasn't one to hold grudges. We had it out, and that was that." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "Do you remember her buying anything unusual from you recently? Perhaps something she might have used for baking?" Mr. Rudge frowned, thinking. "Now that you mention it, she did ask for a small amount of bitter almonds a couple of weeks ago. Said it was for a special recipe." "Bitter almonds?" Miss Marple repeated, her tone neutral. "Yes, but I didn't have any." "Told her to try the apothecary in much Benham," he replied. "Thank you, Mr. Rudge," Miss Marple said warmly. "You've been most helpful." That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected invitation to dine with the Whitakers. Dorothy and Henry were hosting a small gathering, ostensibly to restore a sense of normalcy. The guests included Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry, and Mrs. Plummer, all of whom had their own theories about the case. Miss Marple, ever the attentive observer, noted the strained atmosphere between Henry and Dorothy. Dinner was a modest affair, but the conversation inevitably turned to Mrs. Gosforth. "I still can't believe it," Dorothy said, her voice trembling. "To think someone in this village could be capable of such a thing?" "Perhaps it wasn't someone from the village," Colonel Bantry suggested. "Could have been a drifter or someone with a grudge from her past." Henry cleared his throat, his tone brusque. "Let's not indulge in wild speculation. The police will sort it out soon enough." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, though sometimes it's the details we overlook that hold the key." Henry's gaze flickered to her, and for a moment his expression betrayed unease. After dinner, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, speaking quietly with Agnes. The housekeeper seemed eager to unburden herself. "Mrs. Whittaker's been so nervous lately," Agnes admitted, "and Mr. Whittaker's been snapping at everyone. It's like they're both hiding something." "What makes you think that?" Miss Marple asked gently. Agnes hesitated. "I overheard them arguing in the study the night before Mrs. Gosforth died. Mrs. Whittaker was saying something about a debt, and Mr. Whittaker told her to keep quiet." "A debt?" Miss Marple repeated, her interest piqued. "Yes, but I don't know the details," Agnes said. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but they were shouting." Miss Marple patted her hand reassuringly. "You've been very helpful, my dear. Sometimes the smallest things can make all the difference." The next day, Miss Marple took the bus to Much Benham to visit the apothecary. The shop was a small, dimly lit space filled with the scent of herbs and medicinal compounds. The apothecary, Mr. Price, greeted her with a curious look. "Miss Marple, what brings you here?" "I was hoping you might remember a recent customer," she began. "Mrs. Gosforth from St. Mary Mead may have purchased bitter almonds from you." Mr. Price frowned. "Ah, yes. She came in about a fortnight ago, asking for just a small amount. Unusual request, but she said it was for baking. And did anyone else inquire about bitter almonds around the same time? Miss Marple asked. Mr. Price scratched his chin. Now that you mention it, Mrs. Whittaker was here the day before. She didn't buy almonds, but she seemed very interested in what Mrs. Gosforth had ordered. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind raced. Thank you, Mr. Price. You've been most helpful. Upon her return to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple decided it was time to confront Dorothy Whittaker. She found her in the garden, pruning roses with a distracted air. Mrs. Whittaker, Miss Marple began. Might I have a word? Dorothy looked up, startled. Of course, Miss Marple. What is it? I've been piecing together some curious details about Mrs. Gosforth's death, Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. For instance, the recipe book with the erased note and the missing page. Dorothy's hands tightened on the pruning shears. What are you implying? Nothing, my dear, Miss Marple replied with a faint smile. But I can't help wondering if someone might have tampered with the eclairs. After all, bitter almonds can be quite dangerous if used incorrectly. Dorothy's face paled. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple's gaze softened. If there's something troubling you, Mrs. Whittaker, it's best to come forward. Secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply they're buried. Dorothy opened her mouth to reply, but before she could speak, Henry's voice called from the house. Dorothy, where are you? The moment passed, and Dorothy hurried inside, leaving Miss Marple with more questions than answers. That evening, Miss Marple reflected on her findings. 1. The bitter almonds. Both Mrs. Gosforth and Mrs. Whittaker had taken an interest in the ingredient, a key component of cyanide. 2. The Whittakers' debt. Agnes' confession suggested financial troubles that could provide a motive. 3. The missing page and erased note. These pointed to deliberate tampering with the recipe. 4. Dorothy's reaction. Her nervousness hinted at guilt, but was it her own or someone else's? Miss Marple's fingers paused in her knitting as a realization struck her. If Dorothy had something to hide, she wasn't acting alone. There was another hand in this. Someone who was orchestrating the events from the shadows. The web of secrets in St. Mary Mead was beginning to unravel, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the truth before another tragedy struck. The tension builds as Miss Marple uncovers more secrets and confronts potential suspects. The connections between the bitter almonds, the Whittakers' debt, and the altered recipe tighten the net around the culprit, but the mystery remains tantalizingly incomplete. 4-0. The quiet hum of St. Mary Mead was interrupted by another shocking incident, a theft at the Whittaker residence. This new crime, so soon after Mrs. Gosforth's murder, shifted the village's already unsettled focus. Miss Marple, now more convinced than ever that the events were connected, decided it was time to delve deeper. The news spread quickly. Dorothy Whittaker's antique sapphire brooch, a family heirloom, had been stolen from her bedroom. It was locked away in my jewelry box, Dorothy tearfully told Constable Craddock when he arrived to investigate. I can't imagine how anyone could have taken it. The constable scratched his head. No signs of forced entry? Could it have been someone in the house? Dorothy hesitated. I don't want to accuse anyone, but Agnes does have access to the bedroom. Agnes? Your housekeeper? Craddock asked, raising an eyebrow. She's been with us for years, Dorothy said quickly. I can't believe she'd do such a thing, but, well, I can't think of anyone else. Miss Marple, who had come by to return a book Dorothy had lent her, quietly observed the exchange. Dorothy's distress seemed genuine, but Miss Marple noted the way her hands trembled as she spoke, as if she were more afraid than upset. After the constable left, Miss Marple lingered. My dear, "This is all so unfortunate," she said gently. "That brooch must mean a great deal to you." Dorothy sniffled and nodded. "It was my grandmother's." "Henry will be furious. It's been in his family for generations." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. "May I ask, was it taken the same night as Mrs. Gosforth's death?" Dorothy's eyes widened. "Why, yes." "How did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A simple deduction, my dear. Sometimes timing is more than coincidence." Dorothy fidgeted with her handkerchief. "Do you think the theft and the murder could be related?" "It's possible," Miss Marple replied. "Crimes often intersect in surprising ways. Tell me, was there anyone unusual around the house that day?" Dorothy hesitated, then shook her head. "No, just the usual staff and a few neighbors who stopped by." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I'm sure the brooch will turn up soon." These things often do. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Agnes at the Whittaker estate. The housekeeper was in the kitchen, kneading dough with a determined expression. "Miss Marple," Agnes said, looking up. "Come to see the latest excitement, have you?" "I heard about the brooch," Miss Marple replied, her tone sympathetic. "You must be feeling terribly unsettled." Agnes shrugged. "I've got nothing to hide." "Let them search my things if they want. It won't make any difference." Miss Marple sat at the kitchen table, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Do you have any idea who might have taken it?" Agnes hesitated. "Mrs. Whittaker's been under a lot of stress lately. And Mr. Whittaker, well, he's not the easiest man to live with. But stealing a brooch, that's not something I'd expect from either of them." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And the other staff? Or perhaps a visitor?" Agnes shook her head. "We're a small household. If someone took that brooch, they must have had a reason." Miss Marple smiled. "Very true, my dear. Motive is often the key to solving any mystery." Colonel Bantry, ever eager to share his thoughts, sought out Miss Marple later that day. "Have you heard about the brooch?" he asked, settling into a chair in her parlor. "I have," Miss Marple replied, pouring him a cup of tea. "Well, I'll tell you what I think," Bantry declared. "It's a distraction, plain and simple. Whoever stole it wanted to shift the focus away from the murder." "That's an interesting theory," Miss Marple said, her expression thoughtful. "And do you have any suspects in mind?" Bantry rubbed his chin. "Could be Geoffrey. The lad's in a tight spot with his finances. Or maybe Henry Whittaker himself. He's been acting strangely, hasn't he?" "Quite," Miss Marple murmured. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "What about Dorothy?" "People do odd things under stress." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed they do. But we mustn't jump to conclusions. The truth is often far more complex than it appears." The next morning, Miss Marple took a walk through the village, her thoughts preoccupied with the case. She stopped by the churchyard, where a group of children were playing near the hedgerow. "Miss Marple," one of the children called, holding up a small object. "Look what I found." It was the missing brooch, its sapphire gleaming in the sunlight. "Why, how extraordinary," Miss Marple said, examining it carefully. "Where did you find this?" "Over there, by the wall," the child replied, pointing. Miss Marple's mind raced. The brooch's location suggested it had been discarded in haste. But by whom and why? Later that day, Miss Marple visited Reverend Leonard Clement, seeking his insight into the matter. "Miss Marple," the vicar said warmly, "I suspect you've made some headway in this mystery." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her tone modest. "But I'm beginning to think the theft of the brooch is connected to a much larger scheme." The vicar raised an eyebrow. "Larger scheme?" Miss Marple nodded. "The brooch was discarded, likely to divert attention. But the real question is, from what? "Do you think the thief and the murderer are the same person?" Clement asked. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "It's possible. But I'm more inclined to believe the theft was staged to obscure a vital clue about the murder." That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, knitting in hand, she reviewed the events of the past few days. 1. The timing of the theft. The brooch was taken the same night as Mrs. Gosforth's death, suggesting a deliberate connection. 2. The discarded brooch, its location near the churchyard, hinted at panic or a desire to mislead. 3. Agnes's confidence. The housekeeper's demeanor suggested she had nothing to hide, yet her loyalty to the Whitakers complicated matters. 4. Dorothy's fear. Her nervousness indicated she knew more than she was letting on. Miss Marple's fingers paused mid-stitch as a sudden thought struck her. The brooch wasn't the key. It was the distraction. The true clue lay in what the thief had hoped to conceal. "I do believe we're getting closer," she murmured to herself. "Now it's just a matter of putting the final pieces together." This section deepens the intrigue by introducing a new crime that redirects the villagers' attention. As Miss Marple uncovers connections between the theft and the murder, the stage is set for the mystery's resolution. The discovery of the brooch had cast a peculiar light over the already tangled case. Yet Miss Marple's calm demeanor remained unshaken as she pieced together the implications of this latest twist. She was no stranger to the subtleties of human nature, and her sharp mind was quick to spot what others had overlooked. It was time for her to conduct her own subtle test, to draw the truth from the shadows. Miss Marple's first step was to orchestrate an innocuous gathering. She invited several key figures in the case to tea at her charming cottage: Dorothy and Henry Whittaker, Geoffrey Hargrove, Colonel Bantry, and, much to everyone's surprise, Agnes. The invitation was couched in terms of a desire to lift spirits and foster a sense of unity in the troubled village. Each attendee arrived with varying degrees of suspicion and unease, their faces betraying private anxieties. Miss Marple greeted them warmly, her serene demeanor putting them at ease. Or so they thought. As tea was served, the conversation meandered through harmless topics: the recent weather, a new vicar in the neighboring parish, and Mrs. Bantry's prize-winning dahlias. Miss Marple's questions were gentle but probing, carefully designed to elicit subtle reactions. "Mrs. Whittaker," Miss Marple said with a smile, "you have such an eye for detail. Did you notice anything unusual at the garden party before Mrs. Gosforth fell ill?" Dorothy hesitated, her teacup rattling slightly in its saucer. "No, not really. It all seemed perfectly normal." "And you, Mr. Whittaker?" Miss Marple continued. Henry frowned. "I wasn't paying much attention. I was caught up in a conversation with the Colonel." Miss Marple turned her gaze to Geoffrey. "And you, Mr. Hargrove?" "You were quite the focus of attention at one point, I believe." Geoffrey flushed, only because of that silly argument with Mrs. Gosforth. She had a way of provoking people. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Yes, she could be quite direct, but even the sharpest tongues sometimes conceal deeper troubles. Her words hung in the air, their meaning ambiguous, yet unsettling. Toward the end of the gathering, Miss Marple excused herself briefly and returned with a familiar item: Mrs. Gosforth's recipe book, the very one found in the Whittaker kitchen. "Such a fascinating collection of recipes," she remarked, placing the book on the table. "And yet it seems this book holds more secrets than culinary delights." The room grew quiet. Dorothy's face turned pale, while Henry stiffened visibly. "What do you mean by that, Miss Marple?" Colonel Bantry asked. Miss Marple opened the book to the page where the erased note had been found. "This particular recipe for chocolate eclairs is rather interesting. Someone went to great lengths to alter it. Why, I wonder? No one responded. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, her keen eyes observing each reaction. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "I've also been curious about the bitter almonds. They're a rather unusual ingredient for a village like ours, yet they appeared twice in quick succession, once in conversation with Mr. Rudge, and again at the apothecary. In much Benham, Dorothy's trembling hand reached for her husband's. "Henry, perhaps we should—" Henry cut her off sharply. "Enough of this nonsense. Miss Marple, you're meddling in things you don't understand." Miss Marple's expression didn't waver. "Oh, but I do understand, Mr. Whittaker. I understand that Mrs. Gosforth's death was no accident. It was carefully planned, and the plan involved more than one person." A gasp escaped from Dorothy, but it was Agnes who spoke next, her voice trembling with indignation. "Are you saying I had something to do with this?" "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "But you may have seen or heard something without realizing its significance. Tell me, Agnes, do you recall the argument between Mr. and Mrs. Whittaker the night before the garden party?" Agnes hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but I didn't understand what it was about." "Something to do with money." Henry rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is preposterous. Dorothy and I had nothing to do with Mrs. Gosforth's death." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "And yet the brooch was stolen and discarded in such haste? Why would a thief abandon something so valuable? Unless, of course, it wasn't theft at all, but a desperate attempt to divert attention." Dorothy burst into tears, her composure crumbling. "I can't keep it up, Henry." "I can't." Henry turned on her angrily. "Pull yourself together, Dorothy." Miss Marple's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Mrs. Whittaker, I believe you were the one who altered the recipe, weren't you? But you didn't act alone. Your husband's debts had grown too large to manage, and Mrs. Gosforth's death offered a way out. You tampered with the eclairs, knowing she wouldn't notice the bitterness." Dorothy's sobs grew louder. "I didn't want to." "It was Henry's idea. He said we'd lose everything if we didn't act." "Enough," Henry roared. "You don't know what you're talking about, Miss Marple." "You have no proof," Miss Marple's expression softened. "Proof, Mr. Whittaker, often lies in the small details. Your wife's fear, your defensiveness, and the trail of actions that led to Mrs. Gosforth's death. They all point to the truth. You underestimated how much people observe, even when they seem unassuming." At that moment, the door opened to reveal Constable Craddock, who had been listening from the hall. "I believe that's enough, Mr. Whittaker," he said. "You and your wife will need to come with me for questioning." Dorothy slumped in her chair, her face a picture of despair. Henry, defiant to the end, glared at Miss Marple. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Meddling old woman." Miss Marple regarded him with a mixture of pity and resolve. "It's not cleverness, Mr. Whittaker. It's simply a matter of understanding human nature." After the Whittakers were taken away, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor, her knitting needles clicking softly. Colonel Bantry, who had stayed behind, shook his head in amazement. "By Jove, Miss Marple, you've done it again." I never would have guessed. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's not about guessing, Colonel. It's about observing. People often reveal far more than they intend." Bantry chuckled. "You make it sound so simple." Miss Marple's gaze turned thoughtful. "Human nature, Colonel, is rarely simple, but it is consistent, and therein lies the key." This section delivers a climactic confrontation in which Miss Marple orchestrates the unmasking of the true culprits. Her psychological acumen and quiet manipulation reveal the intricate web of deceit, paving the way for the final resolution. The Whittakers' arrest had sent shock waves through St. Mary Mead. The village, known for its quiet charm and occasional harmless gossip, now buzzed with scandal. Yet for Miss Marple, the case was far from closed. As she sipped her evening tea, she reflected on the events leading up to this moment, her mind circling around one remaining question. Was Henry Whittaker truly the mastermind, or was there yet another layer to this intricate mystery? The next morning, Miss Marple visited Reverend Clement at the vicarage. Over tea and scones, she voiced her lingering doubts. "Henry Whittaker is certainly guilty of tampering with the eclairs," she said, stirring her tea. "But I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this story." The vicar raised an eyebrow. "You mean someone else might be involved?" "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. "The theft of the brooch, for instance. It feels out of place, almost as if it was designed to implicate the Whittakers." Reverend Clement nodded thoughtfully. "And you think someone might have manipulated them?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's not uncommon, dear Leonard, for a clever person to exploit another's desperation." Miss Marple's next stop was the apothecary in Much Benham, where Mr. Rudge greeted her with his usual brusque manner. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his chippy spectacles. "Come to inquire about the bitter almonds again, have you?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone as mild as ever. "I was wondering if you've had any other unusual requests for them recently." Rudge frowned. "Not that I can recall. Except, of course, for Mrs. Gosforth's order." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple murmured. "But wasn't there another purchase, shortly after hers?" The apothecary hesitated, then rummaged through his ledger. "Well, now that you mention it, yes, there was. A small order placed by, oh, this is curious, Geoffrey Hargrove." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened imperceptibly. "Curious indeed. Thank you, Mr. Rudge. You've been most helpful." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Geoffrey, who was busy tending to his roses. He looked up as she approached, a nervous smile flickering across his face. "Miss Marple," he said, brushing dirt from his hands, "what brings you here?" "I was hoping for a word," Miss Marple replied. "About Mrs. Gosforth." Geoffrey stiffened. "I've already told the police everything I know." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing, "but I couldn't help noticing something odd. You purchased bitter almonds shortly after Mrs. Gosforth's death. May I ask why?" Geoffrey's face drained of color. I was baking for the church fete." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Baking, you say? How curious, given that you've often told Mrs. Bantry you can't tell a whisk from a rolling pin." Geoffrey stammered, It wasn't for me. It was for a friend." "And would this friend happen to be Henry Whittaker?" Miss Marple asked, her voice as gentle as ever. Geoffrey's shoulders slumped. "All right," he muttered. "Yes, it was for Henry. He said he needed it for something important, and I didn't ask questions." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "And the brooch? Did Henry ask you to take that as well?" Geoffrey's head shot up, panic in his eyes. "No, I didn't steal anything." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Sometimes, Geoffrey, we become accomplices without even realizing it. Perhaps Henry used you more than you know." Returning home, Miss Marple sorted through the notes she'd made throughout the investigation. A seemingly minor detail now leapt out at her. The handwriting in Mrs. Gosforth's recipe book didn't match Dorothy Whittaker's. She fetched the recipe book and compared it with a letter Dorothy had written her weeks ago. The difference was clear. The writing in the recipe book was bolder, more angular, distinctly masculine. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Could it be that Henry Whittaker hadn't altered the recipe himself but had coerced someone else into doing so? Determined to uncover the final truth, Miss Marple requested a meeting at the vicarage, inviting Constable Craddock, Colonel Bantry, Geoffrey, Dorothy, and even Agnes. The vicar, ever supportive, presided over the gathering with a quiet sense of gravitas. Miss Marple began, her voice calm but firm. The events of the past few days have left us all troubled, but I believe the time has come to set things right. She turned to Geoffrey. Mr. Hargrove, you've been drawn into this web through no fault of your own, but you've withheld information, and that has only made matters worse. Geoffrey squirmed in his seat. I didn't mean to. Miss Marple held up a hand. I understand, but we must be honest if we are to reach the truth. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Agnes. You've been remarkably steadfast throughout this ordeal, Agnes. But I couldn't help wondering, why didn't you speak up about the argument between Mr. and Mrs. Whittaker sooner? Agnes hesitated, then said quietly, I didn't think it mattered. But it does matter, Miss Marple replied, because that argument wasn't about money as we all assumed. It was about a plan to remove Mrs. Gosforth as an obstacle. The room fell silent. Henry Whittaker may have devised the scheme, Miss Marple continued, but he couldn't have carried it out alone. Someone had to alter the recipe. Someone had to steal the brooch to create a diversion, and someone had to ensure the blame fell elsewhere. Her eyes rested on Geoffrey. And that someone was you? Geoffrey leapt to his feet. That's absurd. I didn't kill anyone. No, Miss Marple agreed, but you aided Henry in his efforts, whether knowingly or not. The bitter almonds, the recipe alterations, they were all part of his design. Geoffrey's face crumpled. He said it would fix everything. That no one would get hurt, Miss Marple's voice softened. But someone did get hurt, Geoffrey. And now it's time to make amends. By the end of the meeting, Geoffrey had confessed his involvement, providing crucial details that solidified Henry Whittaker's guilt. Dorothy, too, admitted her role, her tearful apologies revealing a woman torn between loyalty and fear. Constable Craddock, impressed by Miss Marple's deductions, promised swift action. You've done it again, Miss Marple, he said with admiration. Miss Marple demurred. It's not about cleverness, Constable. It's about understanding the complexities of human nature. People often reveal themselves in the smallest of ways. That evening, as the village began to absorb the revelations, Miss Marple returned to her parlor. The fire crackled warmly, and her knitting needles clicked softly as she reflected on the case. Such a shame, she murmured. So much trouble, all for greed and desperation. But perhaps now, St. Mary Mead can find peace again. She set down her knitting and reached for her tea, her thoughts all ready, turning to the next puzzle life might present. This section resolves the mystery by unraveling the full extent of Henry Whittaker's plot and Geoffrey's reluctant involvement. Miss Marple's sharp mind and quiet determination bring clarity and justice, ensuring that the village, and its secrets, can finally rest. St. Mary Mead, with its postcard-perfect cottages and winding lanes, began to settle back into its usual rhythms. Yet the events surrounding Mrs. Gosforth's death lingered like an unwelcome fog. For days after the arrest of Henry Whittaker and Geoffrey Hargrove, the villagers moved about their routines with an air of suppressed excitement and unease, the drama of the case fueling endless speculation and reflection. Miss Marple, as always, stayed quietly in the background. At the grocer's on a crisp morning, Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Price Ridley could be found in their usual corner, whispering animatedly over a shelf of tinned goods. "Well," Mrs. Price Ridley said, her voice tinged with satisfaction, "I always thought Henry Whittaker was up to no good. The way he carried on at the garden party. And poor Dorothy, Such a timid little thing. Imagine her being drawn into something so dreadful. Mrs. Bantry nodded but hesitated. I do wonder, though, what made Geoffrey Hargrove help them? He always seemed so mild-mannered. Perhaps Miss Marple will explain it all some day. Oh, I wouldn't hold my breath, Mrs. Price Ridley replied. She never tells more than she needs to. But I'll wager she knew everything long before the rest of us. Over at the vicarage, Reverend Clement sat in his study, gazing out the window. His wife, Griselda, entered with a tray of tea and biscuits. "You're awfully quiet this morning, Leonard," she remarked, setting the tray down. The vicar sighed. "I've been thinking about Miss Marple, how she managed to unravel everything without causing undue harm to anyone else. It's remarkable." "Really?" Griselda smiled. "She has a way about her, doesn't she? So gentle, yet so unyielding when it comes to the truth." "Yes," the vicar agreed. "She understands people better than most, and she's right. Sin often hides in plain sight, disguised as something mundane." That afternoon, Constable Craddock stopped by Miss Marple's cottage, his expression a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat. "I thought I'd drop by to thank you for your help in the case." "We couldn't have done it without you." "Oh, nonsense," Miss Marple replied, setting aside her knitting. "You did all the hard work, my dear. I simply followed a thread or two." Craddock chuckled. "If that's what you call it. Tell me, though, what gave Geoffrey away in the end?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "His inconsistencies, dear boy. He claimed to know nothing of baking, yet he purchased bitter almonds. And his alibi, though plausible, lacked sincerity. A guilty conscience often speaks louder than words." Craddock nodded thoughtfully. "And Dorothy? Do you think she'll ever recover from this?" Miss Marple's expression grew somber. "Time will tell. She acted out of fear and desperation, but guilt is a heavy burden. Still, the human spirit is remarkably resilient." As evening fell, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, the room aglow with the soft light of a lamp. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, the motion both soothing and meditative. She thought of Henry Whittaker, now facing the consequences of his greed and manipulation. His desperation to maintain a facade of success had driven him to unimaginable lengths, and in the end, it had been his downfall. Geoffrey Hargrove, too, weighed on her mind. A man so easily swayed by promises of friendship and security, he had become an unwitting accomplice in a tragic scheme. Miss Marple hoped his confession would lead to a lighter sentence and perhaps a chance for redemption. Dorothy Whittaker, however, was a more complex case. Her meekness had masked an inner turmoil, and while she had ultimately confessed her role, Miss Marple suspected the scars of her actions would linger. "Human nature," Miss Marple murmured to herself, "is infinitely complex and endlessly fascinating." In the weeks that followed, life in St. Mary Mead returned to its tranquil state. The gossip faded, the garden party grounds were tidied up, and Mrs. Bantry's dahlias once again became the focus of village conversation. Agnes found a new position as a maid in a neighbouring village, grateful to escape the shadow of her former employers. Geoffrey Hargrove's roses, untended since his arrest, were pruned by a kind neighbour. Dorothy Whittaker's fate remained uncertain, but the villagers spoke of her with a mixture of pity and resignation. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained her usual self, quiet, unassuming, and ever observant. She attended church, hosted her knitting circle, and dispensed advice with the same gentle wisdom that had unmasked the truth behind Mrs. Gosforth's death. One afternoon, as Miss Marple sat in her garden, Colonel Bantry stopped by, tipping his hat in greeting. "Good day, Miss Marple," he said. "I thought I'd see how you're faring after all that excitement." "Oh, quite well, thank you," Miss Marple replied, gesturing for him to sit. The Colonel settled into a chair and looked out over the blooming flowers. "You know, I've been thinking. For all the trouble they caused, the Whitakers weren't bad people at heart. Just desperate." Miss Marple nodded. "Desperation can lead even the best of us astray, but it's also a reminder of how important kindness and understanding can be. A little compassion might have prevented all this." The Colonel smiled. "You're a wise woman, Miss Marple." She chuckled softly. "Oh, not wise, Colonel. Simply observant, and fortunate enough to live in a place where people's lives are an open book, if you know how to read between the lines." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the village, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her heart at ease. Another mystery had been solved, another truth uncovered, and life in St. Mary Mead carried on. For Miss Marple, the quiet rhythms of village life were both her solace and her stage, and though the world might see her as a simple spinster, those who knew her best understood the depth of her insight, the sharpness of her mind, and the kindness of her heart.